Hello guys and girls, it's me again, it's Earl from the LearnAnatomy team. Unfortunately Boris Jr. isn't feeling well, so he's not going to be joining me on this shoot. But I really want to thank all of you for watching our YouTube videos, for writing in, for giving us some really good feedback, and for asking for different types of videos. So John wrote in, a student of mine who's currently studying anatomy on a sports related course, and what he wanted to know about, he's currently learning the osteology or the bony markings in and around the shoulder. So he really wanted just a short video to revise, to give some handy tips on how you can learn the bony anatomy of the shoulder. So we're going to start today by just revising what the bony anatomy of the shoulder is and thinking carefully about what structures make up the shoulder as we know it. So the shoulder is actually a combination of 4 joints, and what we need to think about is that the shoulder is really joining part of the appendicular skeleton, the upper limb, to the axial, which is made up of the cranium, the vertebral column, sternum and ribs. So what we need to think about is that the shoulder is actually part of what we call the pectoral girdle. The joining bits from the axial or the center part of the skeleton to the appendicular, or the parts that attach on, appendages. That's where the word appendicular originates. Anything that is attached onto the axial part. So if we start with this bone, the clavicle, that's a key bone to learn. At the medial end, it articulates with the breastbone or the sternum. And the sternum is made up of 3 parts really. The superior part, the top part, known as the manubrium, which articulates with the clavicle to create a joint called the from the sternum, clavicular joint, very important joint. Then the clavicle angles its way around and ends on the lateral side to articulate with what we call the acromion process of the scapula. Scapula is on the posterior side, and that's commonly known as our shoulder blade. So the clavicle, as you can see, it's not a straight bone, it curves around, and in so doing acts as a bridge or a strut, which enables the appendicular skeleton to join to the axial. So at the lateral margin, the clavicle articulates with the acromion process of the scapula. So the first joint is where the clavicle articulates with the sternum, the sternoclavicular joint. The second joint is where the clavicle articulates with the acromion process, called the AC joint or acromioclavicular joint. The main joint of the shoulder that we will look at is actually where the arm, the head of the arm bone, some people find this funny and that's the joke we use, the arm bone is better known as the humerus, and that articulates with part of the scapula called the glenoid fossa. And the best way to think of that joint is really to think of a golf ball sitting on a tee, because what we learn from that image is that the head of the arm bone is bigger than the socket itself. So that creates issues around how stable is the glenohumeral joint, or the ball and socket joint that makes up the shoulder. And then the last joint, which is often missed out, is how the scapula moves along the rib margin to enable certain range of motion. And that movement of the scapula along the rib margin is known as the scapular-thoracic rhythm. And the best way to think that through, if we raise our arm above our head, look at what's happening at the head, it moves down, the scapula has to move up in order for us to raise our arm above our head. So those are the 4 joints: SC, AC, GHJ, glenohumeral joint, and the scapular-thoracic rhythm. So let's go again now and focus on the main bony features of the shoulder blade, or scapula. If we look at this from a posterior angle, we notice that the scapula has a spine, and if you know that the scapula has a spine, that is very useful in aiding your learning, because that spine separates the scapula into a top and a bottom. So when you pick up muscle names that have the word spinatus, it's referring to the spine. So a muscle that, for example, sits above that spine would be called the supra or superior spinatus, superior to the spine. So this little marking over here is called a fossa, and a fossa is a little divot or a flattened surface of bone onto which a muscle will attach. So the spine again runs from the vertebral or medial border right to the lateral border where it terminates in the acromion process. So the acromion process is part of the spine of the scapula. So the top part is called the supraspinous fossa. This little angle at the top is called the superior angle. There's a suprascapular notch, a little notch over there. And then this little mark in the front that looks like a bird's beak is an important piece of bony outcrop called the coracoid process. So the shoulder has two. The coracoid process is inferior to the acromion process. And just below the acromion process, there's a little space there through which muscles, tendons, arteries and nerves pass, and that's called the sub, which means under the acromion. So it's the subacromial arch or subacromial space. And if that space becomes smaller, I can put pressure onto the structures that pass underneath it, therefore causing issues around impingements. Okay. So we've discussed the spine. Now we've discussed the superior angle, the superior border, the superior notch, the coracoid process, the glenoid fossa, which is the socket into which the head of the arm bone, the humerus, articulates to form the GHJ. Then we have the lateral or auxiliary border. Auxilla means armpit. We come down to what we call the inferior angle, the bottom angle, and then we come up onto the medial or vertebral border. And these markings are on the posterior aspect of the scapula. So if you had to look at a person's back and take off the skin and take off the superficial layer of muscles, that's what you would see if you're looking up with the rib cage and the vertebral column sitting over here. If we turn that around, the anterior or front of the scapula is flat. This is called the subscapular fossa. Fossa, once again, a little pivot, divot within the bone. It's flattened and muscles and tendons will sit in this space. So what we're looking at here, imagine we have the rib cage over there. We've taken the ribs away, so we're looking at that through the front of the body. So if we took away the sternum and the rib cage, that is what we would see with the coracoid process inferior to the acromion process. So those are the main bones and bony features. Osteological, remember the word os pertains to bone, osteology, study of bone. If we then move on to the arm itself, we have a number of important features as well. So once again, the head of the arm bone, the head of the humerus is round. On the side, we've got the greater and lesser tubercles, and between them we've got this little groove running called the intertubercular groove or the bicipital groove, because we have the long head of the bicep tendon running over the top, coming to insert on the superior part of that glenoid fossa. Remember, the glenoid fossa, if you think of a T in golf, so golf ball sitting on a T, is very flat. It's flattened with a slight pitch in the center, but it's deepened by a lip of cartilage called the glenoid labrum. So remember, if you take a roll-on deodorant and you look at that ball moving, you can see around that, as Jane pointed out in one of the videos on joints, there's that little lip of cartilage which helps to deepen the socket itself. Then we have an anatomical and a surgical neck. And as we come down on the lateral part, we have a little ridge called the deltoid tuberosity, into which the deltoid muscle inserts. It's triangular. So it's down, and just above that we have a little groove running across called the radial groove, and in a later video we'll look at the structures that pass in and around that particular groove, for example the radial nerve. So going back to it, the key features again, when you're studying the shoulder, think about the different joints that make up the shoulder: SC, AC, GHJ and scapular thoracic joint. Then make sure you identify the key little bony markings on the different bones. And finally, I'd like to end off by just giving you a taste of some of the ligaments that strengthen or stabilize the joint itself. So if you know this bony marking, you can already identify a lot of ligaments that help to enforce, strengthen and stabilize the joint. So we've got one that goes from this marking to that bone, so we're called the Coracoacromial group of ligaments. There's a more medial one which is called the conoid. Don't get that confused with the coracoid. Okay, so the conoid, remember you're annoyed with your clavicle, is the ligament which is more medial. As we move, so it would be over here. A more lateral one coming closer to the joint is called the trapezoid, because it's got 4 sides to it. It's trapezoidal in shape. Then we've got a ligament going from the coracoid process to the acromion, the Coracoacromial Ligament. Then one that joins the acromion process with the clavicle, the Acromioclavicular Ligament. Then a ligament that goes from the coracoid process to the head of this arm bone called the Coracoacromial ligaments. And then we've got 3 main ligaments that help to form and stabilize the capsule around the joint, which is called the superior glenohumeral ligament, the middle glenohumeral ligament and the inferior glenohumeral ligament. We've also got a transverse ligament which holds some of the tendons of the rotator cuff group in place, but that we'll pick up on a future video. So hopefully this video has just given you a taste on some of the osteological and arthrology pertaining to joint. Remember the letters ARTH mean joint, giving you some better understanding of the bony anatomy that makes up the shoulder and joint. If you have any further questions or want us to further expand or explain certain features further, please feel free to write to us. Until next time, enjoy studying anatomy. Please check out LearnAnatomy.uk. Jane has done a great job of revamping our website. We've got these fantastic Vegiman posters. Go online, purchase one, and you will transform the way you think about anatomy and the way that you will use learning strategies to retain what it is you are learning.
Play that song, the one that makes me go on.